Hello, Andy. Welcome to DNVGL's Spotlight on Shipping series. My guest today is Andy Dacy, the CEO of JP Morgan Asset Management's Global Transportation Group. And I'm really very pleased to have with me you, Andy, and you have a long and broad experience from banking, from transportation investments, and you also know a lot about shipping from your role in your current position. So it's great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and really appreciate you inviting me for this discussion. I'm looking forward to it.
And let me start off by, I have said quite a few times that I believe that decarbonization is really the grand challenge for shipping in our generation. Am I right, or do you see it differently, Andy?
Look, I think shipping always has lots of challenges in front of it, but I think from a generational perspective, as you mentioned, I don't disagree. If we look back in time, if we were sitting here 50 years from now and looking back, I would agree that decarbonizing the shipping industry and frankly, lots of other components of the global economy are the biggest challenge that we as a human race confront going forward. And shipping is certainly there to play its part. I'm encouraged by many of the steps we are taking as an industry and looking forward to how those unfold, and they won't be without their hurdles, of course, but I do think we have the tools at our disposal to make meaningful progress in the right direction here.
I was looking at some statistics, and when I look at the percentage of vessels in the world fleet that is on alternative fuels, it's less than 1%. It becomes a little bit better if I look to what's on the order book, then the percentage is around 10. But it tells me that we really need to get properly started on this decarbonization journey if we are to meet the ambitions of the IMO. And what's your view on that? Are we moving fast enough? Should we try more? Should we get going in a different pace?
I'll say to start that I'm optimistic based on the fact that as a communication matter, this is a topic that all the different constituents in the industry are now entertaining and looking at and trying to determine how they'll play their respective parts in that process. So whether it's a classification society, whether it's a ship owner or a bank, charterers, the end user at the end of the day, which often are represented by, let's say, retail companies that market manufactured goods through their own distribution channels. It's a topic that I think is something that's gained a lot of traction. Now, are we moving fast enough? I think that while there's lots of communication, I think there's still lots of uncertainty about what the right path forward is. I mean, there does seem to be some orientation around LNG as a first step. I think is pretty much received wisdom that LNG is a transitory step, but the question is, what is it bridging to? And there's lots of different options, I think, as we all know, out there as potential next steps, whether it's hydrogen or ammonia, and whether it's blue or green ammonia or blue or green hydrogen, all have different sort of aspects to their implementation and their carbon footprint and ultimate carbon neutrality. So, I think in some ways it comes down to participation and cooperation. One of the challenges I think the industry generally has is that we've come out of a time period for the last 10 years where we haven't seen very strong markets. There was overcapacity in the industry, and I've mentioned this before. I think we've worked through that, and from that perspective, I think we're at a good place in time from a supply-demand perspective. Shipping is being increasingly recognized as an important part of the global economy, and I think also one thing that I was particularly comfortable or comforted by is the fact that despite trade wars and tariff battles between different constituents in the global economy, we still saw shipping actually thrive and in some cases, do better than certainly was expected. So with that as a backdrop, my feeling is that with a better supply-demand balance, there will be more capital to invest in transitory technologies, as well as developing the solutions that will help us get towards that IMO 2050 goal. I don't know if it's going to be one size fits all, right? So you can, and maybe I'm getting out of myself, and I'll pause in a moment, but I think you can see application of battery technology in short sea type of situations. Certain types of ships don't lend themselves necessarily to, let's say, wind power, but in certain cases that is a potential option. So it's really a mixture of all these different, whether it be propulsion or enhancements to the hull design or other types of enhancements to efficiency measures. I think there are lots of tools we can use, and we are using them. As you said, the penetration is not that high, but it's beginning. People are talking about it. People are ordering ships that have these elements.
I think you bring up a really important couple of points here. One is naturally the importance of shipping for the world economy, and that is really the most environmental friendly mode of transportation there is to provide goods and services around the world. But let me come back to, you also mentioned this, energy efficiency measures. There are so many initiatives that can be considered. When it comes to new build options, and LNG is certainly one alternative that many consider these days as an alternative fuel that improves the CO2 emissions. There is a question about, who picks up the bill for investing in that. There is a certain capex premium that needs to be paid. And from my conversations, I get the impression that that cost is really, nobody's really willing to take their share of it. And certainly what many ship owners say is that it would be beneficial to have longer charter periods for their vessels in order to, justify this. Are you involved in similar discussions, and how do you see that, Andy?
I think there is definitely a tension there. The ultimate, I think, reality is that, let's just take an owner and a charterer. I think they both want to achieve or move towards carbon neutrality as much as possible. There is the case of money, as you're referring to, and we have seen charterers being willing to provide longer term contract periods to support the investment that goes into maybe de-risking the initial extra cost that certain types of enhancements to ships will entail. But you're right, we haven't seen, let's say, the old age of the 1960s where you could get a 20-year charter for a ship's entire useful life. So I think, that may, to a certain extent, limit the pace of change because it'll become incremental, and nobody wants to shoulder the risk entirely on their own. And I'm sure ship owners don't want to necessarily provide the optionality to charterers that they'll make the commitment, they'll own the vessel, but that technology potentially could change in 10 years' time. And if that's the case, then they have the certainty that at least they can mitigate some of the risks entailed by investing in that asset. So I'm hoping, and we've seen increasingly more examples of this, that there is a meeting of minds, and that there is this sort of movement towards some agreement. I think that's probably the only way forward, really. You have to, I don't think you'll see an owner make that incremental investment and then operate a ship on the spot market. That's unless it's an owner that perhaps has a significant amount of contracted vessels already and is willing to take some risk with perhaps a small percentage of that particular type of ship, then maybe that's a possibility. But in the main, I think you're going to have longer term commitments from a revenue perspective.
Yeah. So it would be quite helpful if we could get, say, more parts of the entire chain to sort of take their part of the risk in a way to get this accelerated. Andy, you are also very familiar with the investment community, and what is really very high on a lot of companies' agendas, and I'm sure many of the companies that are involved in shipping as well, also the charterers, the financiers, etc., are the ESG, agenda, environmental, social, governance issues. And some of that should probably also help drive the decarbonization agenda, or am I just being too optimistic?
I think you're spot on, and ESG and decarbonization really are sort of two sides of the same coin. In fact, decarbonization, I think, is very much part of the E and the ESG. I mean, shipping has come a long way over the last 30 to 40 years. I think just by virtue of the fact that communication technology has improved since the 1960s and 70s. And we certainly have a different shipping world than we had back then. And it's even though, as you said earlier, it's often not recognized in terms of the role that it plays in the global supply chain. Hopefully it's recognized a little bit more than it was in the past. And that trend, I hope, continues. There's a lot of discussion happening with the IMO and some of the crew change issues that we're facing as an industry and member states to try to classify seafarers as essential workers or key workers. And, that's one example, perhaps precipitated by COVID, that is bringing this into the limelight more, and precipitated by a very important issue, which is crew transfers, which we've all been having issues with. But hopefully more of that collaborative activity that we're seeing in this particular instance is applied elsewhere. And if you think about investors, ESG has, I think it's been around for a while, but it really became, I think, a central pillar of the thought process of many institutional investors. Probably took prominence about 5 years ago or so, and you saw lots of developments where, for example, on the public equity side, the MSCI, which is the Morgan Stanley Composite Index, now has ESG coefficients that it applies to many of the publicly traded companies that are within that composite. So that allows investors to assess the impact of their dollars or whatever currency they're investing in going into those companies. And I think that type of thinking is only spreading. And I've said this elsewhere as well. I do think there's a bit of a regional difference in terms of the adoption of ESG as a modality to make investments. Europe is probably at the vanguard of that, and it's most critical. The U.S. is certainly there and considering it. I think Asia is a bit more sort of mixed, but certainly I think China is taking steps in that direction, just in terms of their own domestic policies that they're beginning to adopt, not just in shipping, but more broadly within their economy that are environmentally focused, which I think is just a necessity at the end of the day. If you sit back and you kind of consider in a sober way the impact of all the different sort of elements that do cause carbon emissions, one has to make steps in the right direction. So I think it's here to stay. It's only going to become more and more relevant, and that I think also when you think about the industry, and I don't assume to know how we're going to unfold as an industry generally, but what I can say is that I do think that banking in general, in terms of a capital provider on the debt side for shipping, has consolidated its focus on larger companies. So if one makes the argument that those larger companies are the ones that have cheaper capital and can more afford to invest in extra technology that can help with things like ESG and carbon emissions, then that'll be hopefully a virtuous circle, at least on that side of the business, where these larger entities will work with charterers and other constituents, banks, et cetera, to move that needle forward. And then, look, I don't think, obviously, we're not going to wake up one day and change the entire fleet from being what it is today to being carbon neutral. So that'll be an iterative process, but there's going to need to be companies at the leading edge of that slowly change the composition and the percentage of, let's say, more environmentally friendly vessels compared to some of the older technology that will be phased out. And there may be room for smaller companies on the older vessel side that can play a role there, so that may create this sort of separation, kind of a barbelling perhaps, where you have a more cash unlevered approach on the older vessels, and you can access better leverage or more cheap leverage on the newer, sort of more capital intensive assets. So I think, again, that's one potential future. I've been in shipping long enough to know that it's a dangerous undertaking to predict where this industry goes. But I think that's one trend, at least, that has some traction today.
Great. We recently released this maritime forecast towards 2050, and in that study we actually considered 30 different scenarios. So it just underlines your point that it's really difficult to pinpoint to exactly one thing that you believe in. I would like to just pick up on, you mentioned the lenders and the banks, and we've seen the Poseidon Principles really, becoming a force, at least in Europe. And as far as I understand, there's about 11 signatories now, mostly in Europe, but there is one from the US, I believe, and also one from one or two from Asia. Do you see that initiative is gaining momentum in the, say, the banking industry?
I think it is. I think that it started in the banking community, and while I work at a bank, we participate in a different part of the, let's say, capital stack of shipping, at least, or transportation. So we actually own the assets. But as a borrower, I have certainly, and this ties into what we were just talking about, particularly in Europe, where most of the lending banks for shipping still exist. They do have a strong appetite for environmentally friendly activities. So, and Poseidon Principles is very much designed to support that. My hope is that, and there are other constituents that were part of the discussion process with the Poseidon Principles, that they're not just the purview of the banking community, but that they get expanded. And I know there's trading companies that have been part of the discussion process. I'd like to see end users in different parts of the industry, whether it be, let's say, mining companies, utilities, energy companies, that they also have a role to play. And then owners as well. So, and maybe it starts with the bigger owners that adopt and ultimately comply with what the Poseidon Principles are trying to achieve. But it's almost as if, well, I think the Poseidon Principles become stronger the more that they have supporting them. So, you know, the more constituents, the more participants, the better off they are. It's an ambitious goal. It was a good start. I also think it's important to acknowledge that while we certainly play a part from a carbon footprint perspective, we're actually quite a small part of the global carbon footprint. And when you think about the carbon footprint on a sort of per unit of utility perspective, you know, there's the energy production industry, which is sort of in the 18 to 20% range. There's land-based transportation, which is quite significant. There's agriculture, which is quite significant. So all of those are, you know, in the 15, 20% range, whereas shipping is sort of 2%, a little bit less than that. Not to say that any of it is how should I say, acceptable, but I think that, you know, my hope is that not just shipping, but all these different industries take positive steps towards grappling with carbon emissions going forward.
That's so important. You know, on the LNG side, there's many that talk about LNG as a bridging fuel, and I usually say that I believe strongly that bridge is very long, because you have the possibility also to use the drop-in fuels later on that could be produced from, for instance, renewable sources. So you could produce the LNG from renewable sources, which makes it carbon neutral, or you could indeed use it from, say, the oil and gas industry when you have carbon capture and storage in place. So in my perspective, at least, LNG or gas as a fuel makes a lot of sense. But on a personal level for you, Andy, do you have any sort of favorites that you personally believe in more than the others?
I mean, I think the utility of a ship that is designed to use LNG as a propulsion source, you know, to the extent that modifications can be made in the containment system so that, as you say, we can potentially use hydrogen. I know there's different volumetric issues in terms of what the equivalent energy storage capacity is of certain similar sizes of different fuels, but I think there is versatility in that. One of the things that I find most interesting is what you just alluded to, which is the use of sort of excess renewable energy capacity to, whether it be produce hydrogen, whether it be, frankly, to produce different types of synthetic fuels with carbon capture technology attached to that. And we also, we don't just invest in shipping, but we also invest in aviation. And in some respects, aviation has even a bigger challenge because there aren't that many, battery technology in planes is probably not something that will be viable for some time. So when you think about the aviation industry, finding a carbon neutral fuel, which could be a synthetic fuel that has that energy content that can support the flying a plane across, let's say, an ocean or a continent, there really aren't a lot of choices. And what I'm really excited about is having that, synthetic fuels, as we all know, often take a lot more energy to produce than they actually contain. But if you have this excess energy that's not being utilized, whether it be solar power or wind, why not have a synthetic fuel plant that's nearby producing, using that excess energy during downtime? So I would say that's one thing that I'm very excited about because of the versatility and the fact that it can be applied to existing propulsion systems. Again, there's some cost measures, but we've seen the cost of renewables drop quite precipitously over the past 10 years. And wind power now is in some cases cheaper than gas generation. So that to me is getting pretty exciting, and the more installed base we have of that, the more versatility in utilizing excess capacity we'll have at our fingertips.
I think that's a great way to sort of end this small exchange and dialogue, and being optimistic, and considering also that the renewables will constitute around 50% of the energy mix when we get down to 2050. So, it holds a lot of potential, as you say. Andy, thank you so much for taking part in this Spotlight on Shipping series from DNVGL. And it was truly very interesting to have you with us and sharing your insights.
I did very much. I really appreciate you, as I said, inviting me, and this was a real pleasure. So always happy to participate, and thanks again.